Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 16 Part 2. I'm going to start this video by talking more about the theme for this build. What you know so far is the name Typewriter, which actually mainly refers to a couple of components which are going to make up the main feature for this build. But it also refers in a subtle way to a number of other aspects of the build. I also showed a diagram in Part 1 of the build log detailing the layout for the components and also most of the case mods. But there were many other requests for this build. All of the little details right down to the custom wiring. Some of the other requests were to have a lack of symmetry throughout the build, the case mods and components, to have stock standard internal components but a heavily modified case. Really the main request was to have a lot of exposed metals. So you can see here we have the brass, the copper water blocks, some stainless steel, the nickel plated fittings and some of the other components. The aluminium panel you see here is actually going to be painted, and to go along with the exposed metals, the client requested a paint job which looks like beaten, corroded and burned copper. So the obvious thing to do, and the initial request, was to go with a copper hammer finish, but even using the highest quality materials and the best possible techniques, we just weren't happy with the result. My painter wanted to do it again and I wanted to redo it. The client didn't request to have it redone, but we went ahead and used a completely different technique to get something that was even closer to what the client requested, but just a far better result all round. Because with the copper hammer finish, the problems were, well, basically everything. The color was off, it didn't look anything like the color of copper, it didn't look metallic at all. And also the texture was off. It didn't look like beaten copper. So this is the final result. The case mods and custom paint are now complete, although I do still have a few small internal mods to do. Now I recently made an important video where I talked about some big changes that are coming up at Singularity Computers. Make sure you check that video out if you want some background on what I'm about to talk about. I'll put a link on the screen. You are now just starting to see the results of these changes, and I've been working on all of this heavily over the past 6 months. One of my new employees is Anthony, and he has become absolutely instrumental in these changes and everything that I have planned for the future, because he has the exact skill set and mindset that is needed for me to be able to achieve these goals. And you know, people like this are very difficult to find, and this is one of the things that has been holding me back for a long time, because achieving these goals is not something that I could do completely on my own. I mean, I needed to bring people in and collaborate, but the right people. I mean, just some of the skills that are needed to achieve these goals would take me alone a lifetime to learn. Now, I've been working on a whole bunch of different projects with Anthony over the past 6 months. And most of these are custom cases, and all of them are coming up soon. You're going to be seeing all of them. And I'm actually going to properly introduce Anthony coming up. You're actually going to get to meet him. I'm going to do an interview of all of my employees, go behind the scenes, show everything that I've been working on, what's going on, the new workshop, the tools and all of that. But just to give him a brief introduction, he is actually a race car engineer, and he has many other qualifications. And he's been working in the custom car and race car industry for nearly 30 years now. He's actually well known in Australia. He's been in all of the car magazines many times. And I mean, when it comes to custom paint, airbrushing, all of the skills that go into building custom cars from the ground up, custom engines, car bodies, interiors, right down to the sound systems, every little detail, he can do all of it. Now, just to give you an idea of what went into this paint job, there's actually nearly 30 layers of different products on the surface of this case. And I know some people, the color's not going to be to your fancy, but you need to look past that at what's gone into it. Because first of all it was painted in black, then silver, then it was chromed. And even just chroming the case alone is a big job. Getting it to take properly, the surface prep, After this, a layer was put over it which was weathered, and this had to be very carefully done to look like different types of corrosion on the copper. So you'll notice the pit marks which were done by turning the air down on the paint gun and letting large paint droplets hit the surface. You'll also see lines and kind of different levels in the paint. This was done with different objects, including small paint brushes and even Glad wrap. After this was used a whole bunch of different colored candies, semi-transparent paints, which allow the chrome to shine through from underneath. Then the case was airbrushed, and this was painstakingly done. This took over a day because every little hole needed to be airbrushed, all of the ventilation individually, each individual panel around all of the edges inside and out. After this, more candies, and then finally it was clear coated. And this is actually the first paint job that's gone on any of my cases that I've actually truly been really happy with it, because there's nothing about it that I'm unhappy with. And the main thing is that it's exactly what the client was after, and even beyond that, because the copper hammer finishes just turned out to be, well, really they were terrible. And so we moved away from the hammer finish, from the beaten copper, and made up for it by focusing more on the accuracy of the look of the copper and the color. And instead of going down the path of tarnishing, which would have meant greens and browns, which just didn't really, suit this build, it wouldn't have looked that great. We focused more on the burning, which is the purple, which is what happens when you heat copper. And we also did just a little bit of weathering and corrosion, but I didn't want to take that too far because then it can start to look like mistakes have been made. Now, if it wasn't for Anthony's experience, this paint job would actually be completely experimental. What I mean by this is the products aren't exactly meant to be used like this. It's not really what they were made for, but it's one of a kind. It's something you're not going to see anywhere else. And the company whose paints we used was actually so amazed because they saw this paint job. They were surprised and amazed that their products could be used in this way. And so they actually approached us and want us to test a lot of their prototypes and give them feedback. They're also going to give us a lot of their paints immediately before they're released on the market, so we get them first so that we can experiment with them and show people what is possible with their products. They also want us to take photos of everything that we do from now on and give them to the companies advertising for their products. And this is a multinational company, so an amazing result. Now, just as a bit more of an introduction to Anthony's work, I thought I'd show a couple more that we've done recently. And this is the sort of thing that doesn't usually make it onto my channel, because if I just do a case mod or just do a custom paint job for a case, it's not something I can really make a full video about, so it's not something that I normally show. But because of the incredible work that Anthony does, I'm going to make sure that I show all of these from now on. So we did both of these for M-Wave Australia, an Australian computer company, and both of these were actually 4 packs. So they both went to packs, and this is a Corsair 780T, and we also did a Fractal Node 804. Now the photos and videos just don't do this effect justice. In real life, the effect completely changes depending on the light and the angle you're looking at the case from, so it's always changing. It also looks three-dimensional and like it has infinite depth. You'd be surprised how this effect was achieved. One of the lower layers was actually weathered in a certain way, and from the patterns you might be able to guess how this was done. Despite this, you can see that the case has a perfect mirror finish without any kind of imperfection. Now that the case is ready to start building into, the build is going to move a lot more quickly. So you can see I have all of the components laid out here ready to go. And what I've been doing for the last day is preparing the components ready to be installed into the system. And the reason I had to spend so much time on this was because somebody else actually started this system. It wasn't the client, it was another computer shop overseas. But I ended up starting the mods again because I wasn't happy with how rough they were, the measurements were out. So I started again with the new Case Labs Mercury S3. But what it meant was a lot of these components had been sitting outside of their packaging in somebody else's workshop, and they had also been used for test fitting for the previous mods. So, you know, a lot of them were fairly roughed up. Some of the water cooling components had iron filings inside of them, tarnished and all of that. So what I spent the most time on was actually polishing all of the metals, in particular the copper, which was tarnished, had imprinted finger marks. So you can see here the copper hard drive water blocks are being polished. And the tool that's being used here is not ideal. Coming up, I'm going to show you how I polish metals, plastics, acrylic, and also paint, all of the different techniques, tools, and products that need to be used. What I had to do here, I was still waiting for the correct tools to arrive because I'm still in the process of getting a lot of the tools that I need. So I just had to grab the best tool that was available on the day so that I could get this done. And this is actually a sander. It's an orbital tool. What I needed was a good rotary tool. And I like to use air tools because I'm already set up for that. It ends up cheaper once you've got a compressor. But what I'd normally be using for this is something like a die grinder, a 3-inch rotary tool with between 1 and 3-inch rough or coarse polishing attachments, and a couple of different ones for metal. Also, I have a metal polish I use, which is just amazing, which I didn't have on the day. It just meant that I had to spend a whole lot more time polishing all of the metal surfaces, hours instead of minutes. But you can see that they've turned out great. They actually look better than they did when they were new. And you can see the brass here also looks great. One of the great things about Aqua Computer components is that a lot of them are designed to work with the Aquero. So you can see all of the connectivity on the bottom of this res. It's pretty amazing that we have here a temp sensor, USB connection, alarm, and Aquabus. For this build though, I'm not going to be using any of this, and there's a whole bunch of different reasons for that. One of the main reasons is that the only real reason the Aquero 5 LT is being used in this build is as part of the theme and as a feature. So the only functionality I'm going to be using of the Aquero is its fan management. I'm going to be setting up fan curves, and I'll show you exactly how I'm going to go about that later in the build log. And that's actually another important part of the build, because another client request was to have the fans very quiet, and as part of the top panel feature have the top fan spinning really slowly. So that can all be set up through the Aquero 5 LT. Another reason I'm not using any of the functionality of the res is because on this side of the build, you know, the res is going to be a major feature. I don't want messy wiring coming out all over the place. I'd prefer to be minimalistic about this. It's just going to look a whole lot better. And these features aren't really necessary for a small form factor build like this anyway. Detailed system stats is not exactly something that we need for a build like this where aesthetics are the main priority. So these are the components I'm going to be installing first into the build, and that is because everything has to be installed into this build in a specific order. The reason for that is the extent of the mods and how tight everything is. So these components have to go in first. First of all, the reservoir, then the brass piece, the filter, and the Aquero 5 LT, and you can see that they are now all in position. What I've done, I'm leaving them all loose until I install the fittings, and once I've done that and also installed the pump around the other side, I'll then be able to go back and line everything up perfectly so that the fittings all line up. There's really a lot to consider here, and that's why this build needed to be test fitted so many times. It's all such a close fit. Now, I mentioned in a recent video why I use the particular components I do and why you see them so often in my builds. And mainly what it comes down to is the choices that the client makes. Well, in this build, the client obviously decided to go with components very different from what I normally use. And it's been a long time since I've used Aqua Computer components. I must say I absolutely love them for a whole bunch of different reasons. Before I get started on the positives, I'll just mention the only real gripes I've ever had with Aqua Computer. One is the restrictiveness of some of their components, but this is more a thing of the past now. But you will still notice it with a few of their components, their filters and things like that. Another gripe I've had is the documentation of the Aquero and the fact that for such a long time with the Aquero 5, the software was in beta, it was full of bugs, but once you spend a lot of time figuring it all out, you could get it working exactly how you wanted to. And now a lot of that has been sorted out, so these problems don't really exist anymore. Looking at these radiators and the materials that they're made from, and just the accuracy, the quality, it's compared to everything else that is out there, these are absolutely unmatched. I mean, we have the Delrin ends, which make these radiators incredibly compact, a lot smaller than most other radiators. And also the design of these radiators, the ends come off, which allow them to be infinitely extended. And I mean, just take a look at the inlet and outlet options here. There is enough inlet and outlet options not only to be able to have any configuration you want to, but to be able to run a parallel configuration and even have, 2 loops for one radiator. So in particular, it's the materials that I love. I mean, when I start building my own components, this is the sort of materials I'm going to be using. So we have the copper fins for this one, complete copper core, whereas for the other one, it's still a copper core, but the fins are aluminium. Optimized for low RPM, quiet fans, quiet configuration, and also optimized even for passive cooling without fans. But the stainless steel sides, the Delrin, the copper, and in the fluid path is only copper and stainless. So all round, for a whole bunch of different reasons, these are just amazing radiators, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how they perform. Now, I did mention that one of the requests for this build to go with the theme and the ideas for this build was to have stock standard internal components but a modified case. Now, I have broken the rules with a couple of the components, and that's just because I couldn't resist. I know a lot of people don't like the color of Noctua fans, and so we decided to paint the fans with the same effect that we used on the case. An amazing amount of effort just to do these fans, but in my opinion, well worth it. I mean, the color of the Noctua fans would have actually almost gone with this build for once. It would have suited, but I think this is a big improvement, and these are really going to match up nicely now. The other component I decided to have painted was the BitsPower DDC pump cooler, and this wasn't actually a component we were going to use originally, because the client actually sent me all of the components for this build. And I could have gone ahead and used all of those components without adding or changing anything, but there was a few things I needed to change just to, drastically improve the performance and also the aesthetics of the build. And for example, components like this, I didn't actually add the BitsPower pump cooler specifically for aesthetics or to cool the pump, because that's not really necessary. I actually added it so that I could mount the pump to the bottom of the case. And without this component, that would be impossible, and the pump would be very difficult to hold in position and mount. Often I will mount a DDC pump or a D5 to the reservoir, and that way you can hold the res in position without holding the pump. But when the pump is on its own like this, the BitsPower DDC pump cooler is great for mounting it, because you can see it actually has M4 threads on the bottom, which are the ones I'm going to use. It also has M4 threads on the side, but you can see it turned out really well. This actually was originally the Black Sparkle version. I'm now installing the front 240mm radiator. Before I need to do the custom wiring for the two 120mm fans, because once the radiator is installed, these cables will no longer be accessible. I'm now going to install the two OCZ Vector 256GB SSDs. Now these were chosen by the client. A few people commented on these. You know, I would recommend against them because I've had problems with OCZ SSDs, and if I have a problem with a component, I'll never use it again in a client build unless by client request. Now I have the extra add-on panel for this case, which allows for the installation of two SSDs or 2.5-inch drives underneath the motherboard tray. And this is just a perfect spot for them. They're nice and clean, hidden out of the way there. And you also only need short SATA data cables because the connectors on the motherboard are very close. I've now installed the SSDs and also the 240mm radiator and fans. And you can see that not only am I doing some of the custom wiring as I go, but also the cable management, and both for the same reasons. Once I install, in this case, the pump and also the fittings surrounding it between the reservoir and also the filter, these cables are no longer going to be accessible. So a lot of the custom wiring needs to be done along the way as I'm installing the components. Now moving on to the installation of the motherboard and graphics card. You can see that I've installed the CPU and memory. I just need to install the CPU Waterblock. I've already installed the graphics card Waterblock, and Aqua Computer components were definitely an excellent choice for this build. The radiators and the Waterblocks in particular really suit this theme. They fit perfectly with all of the exposed metals, and I haven't used Aqua Computer components in a number of years, and something that is really surprising me is the quality of these components. I mean, just take a look at this Waterblock. Also, the radiators are just amazing. The Aqua Computer Airplex modularity, the precision of the machining, the amount of copper here in this block, the inlaid stainless steel. I mean, this quality is unmatched, and these Waterblocks also perform right up there with all of the highest performing blocks. I think a lot more people would be using Waterblocks aside from EK blocks, just if there was more options in the way of aesthetics, and also just larger product ranges which catered for a wider range of different components. So I've now installed the motherboard and graphics card. I've also installed the pump around the other side of the build, and something else I've started on at this point is the fittings. So you can see at this point the build is really starting to take shape, but I have had the assembly up to this point previously a number of times when doing the test fitting. Because of the extent of the mods in this build, everything had to be planned from the start, right down to the little details. So what it's meant is that the assembly, there's nothing really to it. The thought went into the planning, the effort went into the mods. Now that I'm doing the assembly, it's very quick and easy, although there is still a few time-consuming aspects of the build, the custom wiring and the tubing, because I am doing acrylic tube bending in this build. You can see that I've used rubber washers between the pump and the case, and I mainly did this to prevent scratching because I've never really had problems with noise or vibration from pumps, mainly recently. I mean, the older DDCs were very loud. I had some problems with those. The newer ones are a lot better, and you know, the D5s are even better. I've never had any kind of a problem with noise or vibration from a D5. Now that I've installed the fittings between the reservoir and pump, I can align all of the components around the other side of the build. The brass section, the filter, and also the reservoir. I had to wait to do that to make sure that those fittings fit properly, that the brass wasn't in the way, so I can now align all of those components and tighten the bolts. Now what I'm doing with the custom cables in this build is all by client request and to fit the theme. So you can see what I've done with the cables for the core components, the 24-pin, 8-pin EPS and 6-pin PCIe. I've used silver wire with transparent insulation, and it's obviously not sleeved. So the client requested wire with transparent insulation, whether it was copper, silver, or a gold or bronze color. And obviously this is to go with all of the exposed metals. But you might be wondering about the sleeving colors that I'm using on the rest of the cables in the build, the green and violet. Now I must say on camera it's really exaggerated. The colors of the sleeving look a lot brighter and the colors of the case actually look more dull than they are. So in real life it does fit a whole lot better. But you know, despite that, I know that these colors are going to be controversial. Why they've been used though is obviously to fit the theme, but these are the colors you see in certain metals when they're heated or tarnished. For example, if you heat polished stainless steel, you are going to see close to these colors: greens, blues, and purples. So I have no doubt there'll be a lot of comments on the colors of the sleeving, but I'll talk more about the custom wiring in the next part of the build log. The next thing I'm going to be working on is the tubing. I'm going to be using acrylic tube and a combination of 16mm and 12mm. But I'm going to start that in the next part of the build log. So that sums up this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and favorite if you want to see more.